but I was given a 10-year prison term. Now, what was funny to me at the time during the hearing is that my friend Shorty, the judge, kept talking about issuing more and more concurrent sentences of X amount of time. 10 years for this, 10 years for that. And by the time it was all added up, it was over 100 years, and my friend Shorty was about to lose it, but he didn't understand that concurrent meant all the sentences were going to be served at the same time. But the 10-year sentence that I got was not really because of the crime I had done. My crime was sleeping with a white woman. That was my crime. Sophia, I believe, served 1 or 2 years. I think her sister served 1 or 2 years, if that much, but I got 10 years. Now, when I got to prison, I kind of kept with my streak of being defiant. Now, the thing you got to know about me is I was not a religious person at that time at all. I was not someone that was raised as a Baptist or any religion that was common for black folks at that time. In fact, I didn't believe in religion at all. In prison, I was so defiant when it came to religion that, believe it or not, they actually started to call me Satan in prison. That was my nickname in prison. I'm not kidding, it was Satan. I did not want to hear anything. And I was trying to run hustles in prison as well, too. Trying to always figure out the angle, something I could do. But then a gentleman that I saw in prison really impressed me, a black gentleman. And what I noticed about this gentleman is that when he spoke, people listened to him. Everything he said, he would have them just listening on the edge of their seats. And I was like, what hustle does this guy got going? What is he doing? He seemed to know about everything. He loved to debate and argue, and there was nothing that you could challenge him on. I had no clue what was going on with him. And so finally I asked him, what are you doing, man? What is your hustle? Why does everybody listen to you and talk to you constantly? And he said, brother, it's because I read. I said, well, you read? I said, no, man, you're kidding me, right? You read? What do you mean you read? And it's because he was a reader. He was reading, he read everything he could get his hands on. And because of that, he knew about everything. He could debate about everything, he could discuss everything. And it occurred to me at that time, well, hey, maybe I should start reading too and start learning about some things. Maybe that'll help me in some way. So I started reading. I started reading everything I could get my hands on. I used to read nights and days. I even read the dictionary. That's how much I was reading. I read all the time. But still, I hadn't found a path at that point. That was until my brothers and sisters started writing to me about this new religion that they discovered. And I was very skeptical because, as I told you, I was called Satan, and there was no way Satan was going to start worshiping any religion. But my brothers and sisters were telling me that they found this religion that was the true religion of the black man. It was the religion that said black people were the original people. That's what this religion said. And my brother Reginald told me, he said, look, Malcolm, if you stop smoking and stop eating pork, that'll be a good start. And I thought, okay, I'll stop doing that, because I thought at the time, not eating pork and not smoking was going to help me get out of jail. I was convinced that was a hustle. So I stopped smoking, stopped eating pork, and I just figured maybe I'd get some stomach thing going on, or maybe something else would happen where I'd be able to get out of jail. So I kind of started doing that. I didn't smoke, I didn't drink. And then Reginald came to prison at one point, and as we were meeting, he started telling me about, well, you know who the devil really is. He said, don't you know who the devil is? I said, no. And he said, look over to the right of you, look over to the left. And what I noticed was that there were these folks, and I said, yeah, I see those people. Why are they the devil? He said, because they're white. And he said, all white people are the devil. And that teaching was from the leader of this new religion called the Nation of Islam. Now, the Nation of Islam was founded in the 20s, and at the time, the leader of the Nation of Islam was the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Now, Elijah Muhammad actually had served 5 years in prison himself before when he was the leader of the Nation of Islam, for dodging the draft. So I started learning about this religion. And it appealed to me because of this idea of white people being the devil, because when I started reflecting back in my life, I could not think of any positive experience I had ever had with a white person. Every experience I'd ever had had been negative. So that's what I started thinking, well, hey, that sounds like a good idea. I guess that's what's really going on. And so I started studying as much as I could, started learning to pray, and doing everything I could focus. I eventually got transferred to a nicer prison, and this nicer prison I got transferred to, they had a massive library. The facilities were better. We actually had teachers there that talked to us that were from Harvard and Ivy League schools. We had all kinds of classes. I was able to educate myself. So while I only got through the 9th grade, I feel like I have a master's degree in some of the things that I learned. So while I was in prison, I was constantly focusing on this. Now, when I got out of prison, my main focus was getting involved with the Nation of Islam. So as quickly as I could, I actually went to meet the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And he took me under his wing. And he made me feel welcome. And he taught me about Islam and what it meant to be a black person and to be proud of being a black person. Now, we did not believe in integration as part of the Nation of Islam. I know that Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders, that was their big push, integration. We did not believe in integration. We did not believe it was possible for black people to be with white people. Our belief, and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad's belief, was that black people actually needed to have a separate nation within the United States. Now, one little known story about me that's not really in the books that are written about me is that in the 50s, I actually had a meeting with the KKK, with some of the leaders of the KKK. And the purpose of that meeting was to discuss the idea of setting up a separate black nation. And believe it or not, they were completely supportive of this idea. In fact, they were all about that idea. And several weeks later, one of the leaders of the KKK at a meeting actually proposed the idea of giving the city of Atlanta to black people. And I guarantee you that idea came out of our meeting. But the interesting thing, the unique thing that happened in that meeting, which really stuck with me, which made me question their motives. Now, not that I shouldn't be questioning the motives of anybody that's in the Ku Klux Klan, but what made me question the motives completely was that they actually started asking me over and over again what I knew about Martin Luther King. You know, if I had any access to his schedule, if I knew how to find out where he was going to be. And of course, I told them I had no idea about Reverend Martin Luther King's schedule. But it was obvious to me at the time that part of that motivation, part of what was going on with them, part of that was actually trying to get me to get them in a position where they could possibly look to assassinate Martin Luther King. So that was something to me that I had a problem with. And also that was at the time that I started questioning a little bit some of our teachings, and the idea of working with the KKK actually made me step back and take pause a little bit. Now, when you are a member of the Nation of Islam, there are certain rules you have to follow as that member. Obviously, rules like no smoking and drinking. Obviously, one of the major rules is that you have to be faithful to your spouse. If you don't follow these rules, you can be expelled, kicked out of the Nation of Islam. In fact, my brother Reginald, who was actually one of the people that initially recruited me into the Nation of Islam, actually was kicked out for some of the rules he violated. In fact, there was one point where Reginald came to one of our restaurants, one of our businesses, and I actually had to have him leave, and I couldn't talk to him because he'd been expelled from the Nation of Islam. Also around this time, I was getting rumors and hearing things that there was some jealousy about my presence and my power in the Nation of Islam. Some people were saying that I thought I was number 2 to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. But what I would always tell people is that there is no one number 2. Everybody in the Nation of Islam was number 2 to Elijah Muhammad. In fact, the media offered me several interviews. Life magazine wanted to do a cover story on me. I told them specifically, you should do a story on Elijah Muhammad. Newsweek wanted to do a cover story on me. I told them specifically, you should do a story on Elijah Muhammad. But that also started getting back to him. And it was painful for me as this was happening because I had actually played a major part in expanding the Nation of Islam to thousands of members. I was actually head of the Temple number 7 in Harlem at that time. I was well respected by many people in the nation, so that was difficult for me. But the thing that really changed me a lot is when I started hearing rumors that Elijah Muhammad may have been the father of some children of some of the women that were part of the nation. And that actually had a major impact on me. At first, I didn't believe that rumor was true. These women had been expelled from the nation, which was obviously not fair to them. So I actually talked to Elijah Muhammad about that and asked him. And initially he denied it, but eventually he actually did acknowledge it. And we started talking about ways that we could bring this up as part of where he is as a prophet, that sort of thing. But I did talk to these women, and they all confirmed the stories for me. And that was a very hard situation for me. And so that started creating the initial split between me and the nation. The other thing that actually caused a split was when President Kennedy was assassinated. Now, I'm sure all of you have heard of that. And at the time, you have to understand, in America, violence, different types of violence was very prevalent and happening. There was a lot of things happening in America. That wasn't too far from the start of the Vietnam War. The civil rights movement was in full swing. There was a lot of violence happening. And I was asked by a reporter, what did I think of the assassination of President Kennedy? And I answered honestly. And my honest answer was, it was just a case of the chickens come home to roost, and that it never makes me sad when chickens come home to roost. Now, when I said that answer, that was not a threat towards anybody. That did not mean that I did not care that he was assassinated, but I was pointing out the fact that my belief that his assassination was part of the violence of that time. But Elijah Muhammad was very unhappy when I made that statement, because people loved President Kennedy. You probably know it. He was one of the most popular presidents we had. You all probably heard of Camelot. They were considered the American Camelot at that time. And I was silenced by Elijah Muhammad for 90 days and told that I could not speak. So that was one of the other issues. So during that time when I was silenced, trying to figure things out, there were other things happening. There were the riots that were happening in LA, and there were a lot of black Americans that were questioning the Nation of Islam and whether we were willing to help out. There was a real view at that time that the Nation of Islam was only willing to help their own members. And that really bugged me, because I felt that we should be involved in any struggle with black Americans, no matter what their views were. But that wasn't really the view of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. But after this split, I did one of the most important things in my life. I did the pilgrimage to Mecca, what's called the Hajj. Has anybody here heard of the pilgrimage to Mecca or the Hajj? Okay, good, a few people, all right. So Mecca is the holiest city in Islam. And taking the pilgrimage to Mecca is one of the things that all Muslims should do once in their life if they're able to afford to do it. Now, obviously, financially, we did not have any money. My wife and I would often have discussions about money. We'd have arguments about them quite a bit. She would often tell me that we needed to be saving something, because what if something happened to me? And that was, of course, a valid concern at that time, because I started having these feelings that maybe I wasn't going to be too long for this world. Now, I know that may sound kind of superstitious, but in my family, there's a history of that. In fact, before my father was murdered, my mother, the day that he left, when he was going to his meeting that day, she actually ran out and asked him not to leave because she had a dream about him being killed. So even in my mind at that time, I kind of knew that I may not be for the world long. And my wife had always pressured me. She said, you know, you got to have some money, put some money aside. I assured her that if anything ever happened to me, that the Nation of Islam would take care of her and the kids until they were adults. In addition, our house was actually owned by the Nation of Islam. And so when I actually started separating from the Nation of Islam, they started suing us to leave our home. There were other things happening around this time period. Our house was firebombed as well. And I started thinking this may be related to my relationship with the Nation of Islam. But nonetheless, my sister Ella, who had also been a member of the nation and had recently left, was willing to pay for my trip to Mecca. And it was one of the greatest gifts that she could have given me. Because on this trip, I met Muslims of all colors, of all backgrounds. And I had never experienced that level of brotherhood. Some of the people I met had blue eyes and blonde hair. I met people in Saudi Arabia and Mecca that would have been considered white in the United States. It started to completely change my view. And what I realized is that being white in America was a very different thing than being white in other parts of the world. Being white in America, as we were talking about, was more about an attitude, about a privilege. It was about this idea that being white somehow made you better than people that were black or people of other colors. But that's not how it was in Mecca. In fact, on my way to Mecca, one of the interesting things that you may not know is on my way to Mecca, on my flight over there, I actually did a layover in Frankfurt, Germany. And what was very strange to me in Frankfurt, Germany, which was the oddest thing, is that when I would go into businesses there and I would meet the shopkeepers, they would aggressively come meet with me and talk to me and were super friendly. I was taken aback. I had never experienced that in America. In America, if I went in the store and bought something, I was just a customer, bought something. I was a black customer and bought something. But on my travels, I learned this was not the case. And one of the letters, because I had to write many letters back after I had this experience in Mecca, one of the letters contained this language that I wrote to the brothers in my mosque that I had founded. There were tens of thousands of pilgrims from all over the world. They were all colors, from blue-eyed blondes to black-skinned Africa. But we were all participating in the same ritual, displaying the same spirit of unity and brotherhood that my experiences in America had led me to believe never could exist between whites and non-whites. That's how profound the change was for me. And at that point, when I got back, when I came back to the United States, I was willing to work with all people that were seeking justice. I started viewing the humanity and injustices of the world as all combined together, and I used it as my role to help with any cause that I could at that time. That's where I was coming from. Now, one of the little known things that you may not know is that I was at that time attempting to get the United Nations to actually start a criminal human rights violation suit against the United States, because I started feeling that the treatment of black Americans was a human rights violation and not just an issue of civil rights in the United States. That's something I was heavily pushing for at that time, and something that I wanted. Now, because of my leaving, of course, the Nation of Islam, I actually ended up founding my own mosque in New York. And in addition, when I got back from Africa, I founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity. The ultimate mission of this organization was to reconnect black Americans with their African heritage, establish economic independence, and promote black self-determination. A big part of our organization was focused on voter education and voter registration, an issue that I'm sure some of you have heard of and has become pretty important nowadays, currently. And in this organization, we were willing to take the help of anyone that was willing to help us out. However, one of the things that I think is kind of controversial, one of the things I'll make clear, and I'll explain my reasons behind it, is that we did not allow white people to join our organization. And the reason for this is because my feeling is that white people could do a better job speaking to other white people about issues rather than working with us in our organization. You know, you can come work with you came to work with our organization, you'd be kind of working with us and not really getting out to speak to your folks. And that's the reason that we took that attitude about that organization at the time. But we were indeed willing to work with anybody. Now, as some of you know and may know, after this transition, I didn't have much longer on this earth, unfortunately. At that time, there were lots of different forces going on. I was being monitored by several government agencies, and the Nation of Islam also was very unhappy with what I was preaching. So unfortunately, I was assassinated. And to this day, it's not clear who actually killed me. We don't know to this day who made that happen. But I do think some of the things that I did talk about are still pertinent today and still relevant. I do think that we've made a lot of great strides. I think this country has made some great strides, but I think recently that we've seen that we still have a lot of work to do. And I hope that you folks are able to get out and have discussions, and I hope you're able to take this information and pass it along and maybe learn a little more. And that's my hope today. But I'd like to ask here, are there any questions, anything people are curious about? Yes?
How did you go about, in discussions with white people, how did you go about kind of teaching them? Did you believe that it was your job to teach about the wrongdoings towards black people, or did you believe that it was their job to educate themselves about it?
That's a great question. I just tried to talk to them about the plight that was going on, and I tried to talk to them about it from a humanist standpoint, and the standpoint that all people believe justice. I also tried to make them understand that the foundations of this country set up a certain dynamic that they need to work with. And one of the reasons that I really believe that, it's not that I have anything, it's not a racial choice to not have people involved in our organization. It's more a belief that, white people can do a better job speaking to other white people about the issue of race relations. One of the things I always say, that I believe in is that if there's a racial issue, if I say something about it, I become categorized as an angry black man talking about the racial issue, as where for a white person, when they can talk to a white person about it, I think it's much more helpful. Good question. Any other questions? Yes?
When does it become, when white people try to teach other white people about these problems, when does it become that we're speaking over black folks?
That's a good question. I think, really, you don't, I think it would become speaking over black voices if you're trying to act as if you know what black people may feel about a certain issue. I think that most of us have a common sense idea of what fairness is, of what's right and wrong. I know one of the common phrases that's used today that wasn't around when I was there, but there were variations of it, is talking about this idea of being politically correct or being woke. That's a common word that I know a lot of folks use today. Are you woke? To me, politically correct is not being politically correct. It's just being respectful of other people and not being offensive and respecting that there are other people with other views that have the same rights as you do. But I think the biggest thing is just not speaking as if you have personal knowledge of someone's experience. And one story I always like to bring up is, to this day I feel bad, there was actually a young white college student that came out of one of my speeches when I was still with the Nation of Islam, and at that time, she actually approached me and asked me if there was something she could actually do to help with the cause. And I flat out said to her, she said, "Is there anything I can do?" And I said, "Nothing." And I wish to this day that I could find that young woman and tell her that there are things she could do, but at that time, I did not believe it was possible for white folks to do anything, but you ought to understand at that time, my view was that white folks were not capable of that kind of change. Any other questions? Yes?
Was your family looked after and paid for?
Was my family looked after and paid for?
Yeah.
After my death?
Yeah, were they taken care of?
Oh, no, they were not taken care of. We were not in the Nation of Islam at that time anymore. So we were no longer. We had people help us out, but we were not in the Nation of Islam. So that separation had been made at that point. So unfortunately, that did not happen. Other questions? All right. Yeah.
Did your siblings go on to carry out your legacy?
Yeah, some of them did. Well, interesting, one of my siblings became a professor. Some of them actually did. Some of them spoke about me later on. I will say that many of my children did go on to carry out my legacy. Unfortunately, one of my daughters passed a couple years ago. And unfortunately, my wife passed because of an incident with my grandson. But yes, many went on to carry on the legacy, and a lot of them are very successful people at this point in time as well. Yes?
What do you think is the best way to kind of today, like not pay homage, but kind of like pay respects to, like ways that white people can pay respects to past things that happened in relation to black people, and how can they, I know it's kind of a hard thing to say because a lot of white people say like, well, I didn't do that to black people, so why should I try to change like the things that are happening today? What do you think is the best way that they can kind of come to understand that it's not that people are blaming them for what happened, but it's that you still have to be respectful of the things that happened in the past and like be knowledgeable about it?
I don't know that it's an issue of paying respect more so. I think it's an issue of just acknowledging the history. I think that's the first step, is not pretending that certain history in this country didn't happen. I think it's important that all facets of American history are discussed and are brought up. I also think it's important for people to understand that, it's not about whether your family owned slaves or that sort of thing. That's often an interesting, and in fact, many black Americans like myself, we actually do have mixed backgrounds. We're all, a lot of us, there's not very many black people in this country that don't have some European heritage, in their background. In fact, there are many people that think they're 100% white. When they do a DNA test, they find out, oh, I guess I have a little, African heritage as well. But I think it's understanding that black Americans are starting from a very different place, historically speaking. When you talk about things like income disparities, as I mentioned earlier, for a black person to get any kind of, I was told I could not become a lawyer. For a black person to get any kind of job, professional job, was extremely difficult for years. Even when things like the GI Bill happened and things like that after the war. If you're not familiar with the GI Bill, it was a bill that allowed many soldiers after World War II to get a college education. Many black soldiers were not really given that same opportunity. Things such as purchasing houses. there was something called redlining, and I don't think it's very common today, but redlining was a situation where certain neighborhoods would have these borders around them that would say black people could not purchase a house in certain neighborhoods. So financially, there are a lot of reasons why there's some big economic disparities, and I think some people tend to think, oh, it's because your people don't try hard enough. They just don't want it bad enough. But the fact of the matter is, if you have a family in this country that has been generating and creating wealth for the past 200 years, or even 100 years, you're going to be in a much better position. I think this will be the last question.
I think redlining still affects the suburbs really well still to this day because of the past action. It still affects the overall like suburbs.
Yeah, and even though I'm a dead man, from what my understanding is, I believe you're correct. So thank you for the comment. All right, well, thank you, folks. I really appreciate your time and attention.